The sea is still, almost too still. You're standing on a dock that smells of iron and old rain, watching men in dark coats speak without moving their hands. Crates sit like silent animals in the fog. Someone writes a word on a clipboard. Not the true word, never the true word, just enough syllables to cover what's inside. You can feel it in the air, a plan pretending not to be one. Before you drift off, take a breath with me. If these quiet journeys through history speak to you, take a moment to subscribe, not out of habit, but to keep these untold stories alive. And before we drift deeper, tell us where you're listening from, or which image lingers with you the most. We'll walk softly, past the names and the maps, into a story told in code. You're listening to Echoes of War. Chapter 1. Maskarovka. They called it a nadir, a name borrowed from a cold river far to the east, a place of tundra and reindeer and almost no one at all. It was a trick, a winter coat draped over a summer secret. Orders moved through offices like a draft under a door. Move the regiments. Ready the ships. Speak as if we're going to the north. In barracks, conscripts packed wool, not linen. They were told to expect snow. They carried skis onto trains headed south. At way stations, station masters raised their eyebrows and stamped papers anyway, because stamp first, ask later is its own kind of discipline. On the outskirts of port cities, warehouses breathed in the dark. Missile tubes were wrapped in wooden ribs and labeled agricultural machinery. Warheads traveled like shy guests, low profile, dim light, fewer witnesses. Each piece acquired a false biography, a name that would not betray it if overheard. You watched the clerks doing the arithmetic of silence. Tonnage without truth, schedules without explanations. They don't need to know where the ships are really going. They only need to make sure the manifests make sense to someone who never touches the sea. Chapter 2. The Cold Iron. At the quays in Severomorsk, Murmansk, Baltiisk, iron moaned the way ships do when they dream of leaving. Freighters stood with their mouths open, cranes feeding them in long, careful breaths. Night work, mostly. Night forgives. Crates came by rail, tarpaulins drawn tight like skin over bone. A foreman checked the balance with a cigarette tucked behind his ear and a pencil behind the other. "Careful," he said, though no one needed the word. Some cargo is obvious even when it pretends not to be. The sailors learned their aliases. They practiced saying tractors with straight faces. They were told to wear civilian coats on deck, to keep to shaded corners if foreign eyes watched from nearby piers. One ship took aboard an entire regiment of men who were asked to become ghosts for a season. When the lists were complete, the harbor pilot signed the last page with a dull pen, blew on the ink, and nodded to the captain. Tugboats nosed the freighter's ribs. The rope fell from the bollard. A slow, heavy turning. Steel chose the ocean. Chapter 3. Blue that looks like forever. The Barents gave way to North Atlantic swell, grey on grey, wind trimming the tops of waves into white script. The ships spaced themselves like commas, never a sentence long enough to be obvious. Radio discipline became a religion. Short words, long silences, the grace of nothing to report. On deck, sailors stared into a horizon that never got closer. The cargo held its breath below, wood creaking, chains murmuring, bolts deciding whether to stay honest. Sometimes a crate sighed the way old houses do. Men looked up, swallowed, and went back to their work. A storm rose like a thought no one wanted to have. For 40 hours the ocean spoke in fists. A crate shifted, then another. The boatswain tied a prayer knot you had never seen before. Hands burned raw with salt and rope. A conscript vomited quietly into a bucket and apologized to no one in particular. At night, the stars took attendance. The ships answered by not sinking. Chapter 4. Customs without questions. Some freighters went the long way, hugging neutral harbors where the paperwork had to look normal in harsh daylight. In one port, a clerk with a tired mustache tapped a crate with the toe of his shoe and wrote harvesters on his form. He had never seen a harvester this shape, but it wasn't his field, he told himself, and fields are complicated. Sailors were told to smile like men who moved grain. They kept their caps low. They bought postcards and didn't write them. A man in a blue jacket asked a question in a language the captain did not technically understand, so the captain did not technically answer. Both men were relieved. When the ships sailed again, the harbor exhaled, unaware it had held a piece of the future in its hands and let it pass, the way water lets go of light. Chapter 5. Landfall. Cuba rose out of the haze like a coin from the bottom of a fountain, suddenly there, suddenly heavy with meaning. The harbor smelled of diesel and mango peel, salt and new concrete. Dockworkers with thin arms and strong backs guided the ships in with small shouts and quick hands. Night unloading again. It was always night. Trucks lined up like patient insects, canvas covers breathing in and out. Soldiers stepped ashore and learned the island by its sounds. Frogs, guitars, distant laughter that tasted of rum and bravado. They were told not to speak to anyone who didn't have a uniform, not to tell even those who did where they had come from. The crates found warehouses. The warehouses found guards. The guards found shade and cigarettes and the habit of pretending to see nothing but the door. In the morning, fishermen pointed their boats at the horizon and squinted. Something in the water traffic felt new. But new is not a crime, and breakfast is breakfast, so they went on with it. Chapter 6. Sugar Fields, Red Earth. Convoys rolled inland under tarps, engines coughing dust. Roads narrowed through cane that shivered like green rain. Farm dogs barked as if they recognized the smell of strangers and couldn't place it. In clearings the color of dried blood, teams assembled what the manifests never admitted. Missile frames lay on trestles like bridges waiting for a river. Cranes spoke in careful syllables. Men in caps kept clipboards immaculate as if neatness might save them later. Warheads arrived last and quietest. Their containers were moved by the fewest hands, the most watchful eyes. A lieutenant ran a finger along a gasket and nodded to himself for reasons he didn't share. Everything had the tempo of a heart that intends to keep beating. Camouflage went up. Palm leaves, netting, a painter's thin miracle on raw concrete. Seen from above, the fields were fields again. Seen from the ground, they were promises. Chapter 7. Havana Nights, Radio Mornings. The city carried on. It always does. Cafes opened, dominoes clicked. A couple argued softly over a pay packet that would not stretch. On a rooftop, a boy launched a paper airplane toward the sea. It circled once and came back, as if the wind had changed its mind. Transit police waved trucks through with bored hands. A rumor floated. The Russians have brought doctors, maybe teachers, maybe tractors. The rumor was not wrong in the ways that mattered to people who had chores to finish. In a white office with a fan that wobbled, a Cuban colonel wrote a list of sites no one was to discuss on telephones. He locked the list in a drawer. Keys jingled like small bells of secrecy. Chapter 8. The Camera That Waited. Far away, a schedule tightened. Satellites were still rumors, but airplanes were real enough, and the men who planned their flights used pencils as if softness made better decisions. Weather was studied like a language. You learn to read clouds the way a doctor reads faces. One morning, the air over Cuba became clear as a verdict. The U-2 rose into it with the indifference of a tool doing its job. On the island, the cane breathed, cranes idled, tarps lay still. Above all that, a camera blinked the oldest spell there is. Show me. It did. The quiet before the breath. By the time the last ship left the last dock, the ocean had learned all the names it wasn't supposed to hear and promised to keep them. The crates had become shapes. The shapes had become shadows. The shadows had learned to blend with fields. You stand again where we began, on a dock that now remembers too much. The plan with the winter name has done its summer work. Somewhere far away, men in shirt sleeves will lean over light tables and see what was never meant to be seen. Part 2. The 13 Days That Almost Ended the World. A discovery in the sky. It starts, as many turning points do, with something routine. A pilot waking before dawn. The air hums with a quiet that feels unnatural. You're standing in a world balanced on a breath, radios whispering static, clocks ticking louder than they should. Outside, children play under a pale October sky, their laughter cutting through a silence no one understands. In the distance, somewhere past the horizon, ships move slowly through blue water that could vanish in fire at any moment. You can feel it, a vibration beneath ordinary life, as if the planet itself is waiting to know if it will see another sunrise. Chapter 1. The Edge of the Abyss. It begins quietly, as endings often do. No trumpet, no thunder, just the small sounds of an ordinary morning. A kettle sighs on a kitchen stove. A newspaper rustles open, its black and white headlines whispering of distant tension, of ships and speeches most people barely understand. You pour your coffee and notice the stillness outside, the kind that carries a warning you can't quite name. The year is 1962, but it could be any year when fear becomes invisible and domestic, folded neatly between cereal boxes and evening news. Televisions murmur in living rooms across America, their screens showing presidents with lined faces and words carefully chosen not to frighten. But they do. In Moscow, a man straightens his tie, thinking of rockets hidden beneath foreign soil and the weight of decisions that can't be undone. And somewhere in Havana, a soldier watches the sea, counting ships that shouldn't be there. You're in all of these places at once, or maybe you're just in the space between them, where silence holds its breath. Every minute feels heavier than the last. You can almost hear it, the ticking of a clock that belongs to everyone and no one. It's the sound of diplomacy failing, of pride rising, of a world learning how fragile it really is. For 13 days, humanity will live on this edge, pretending to carry on as if the edge isn't there. Children will go to school. Lovers will argue about nothing at all. And beneath it all, the ground will tremble with the possibility of never seeing tomorrow. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the weight of that air, the faint metallic taste of fear, the paper-dry feeling of waiting. That's where our story begins, not in battlefields or ruins, but in living rooms, classrooms, and war rooms filled with smoke and second guesses. The world is holding its breath, and no one knows yet if it will be allowed to breathe again. Chapter 2. A Discovery in the Sky. It starts, as many turning points do, with something routine. A pilot waking before dawn, pulling on a flight suit that smells faintly of oil and cold air. Coffee half finished. A checklist murmured under his breath. The hum of engines warming in the Florida darkness, and the slow ascent into a sky too quiet to reveal its secrets. From 30,000 feet, the world looks harmless, soft, folded clouds the curve of an ocean pretending to be calm. Below, Cuba glimmers faintly through haze and humidity. A ribbon of roads, fields like quilt patches, and tiny shapes moving where no one should be watching. The U-2's cameras blink open, mechanical eyelids capturing more truth than words ever could. Each click of the shutter steals a secret. By the time the pilot lands, the world has already changed, though no one knows it yet. The film canisters, still warm from the flight, are locked in metal cases and carried into a room where men in shirt-sleeves lean over light tables. Magnifying glasses slide across glossy strips of film, and suddenly the impossible has a shape. Long, dark cylinders resting in neat rows on Cuban soil. Missiles. Soviet. Pointed north. The analysts don't speak at first. One coughs. Another looks at the clock. There's a sense that history has just crossed a line it can't uncross. Outside, cars pass, children shout, phones ring, the ordinary world spinning on, unaware that the fuse has been lit. In Washington, the images arrive in sealed envelopes, carried through corridors where silence feels thicker than concrete. When President Kennedy sees them, he doesn't say much. Just a nod, a slow exhale, and a look toward the window where the light has already begun to fade. The photographs lie on his desk like confession and accusation in one. The room fills with quiet voices, advisors, generals, men who know the shape of war but not how to stop it once it starts. Every word is weighed like a coin dropped into a deep well. Each possible response, invasion, blockade, negotiation, carries its own kind of ending. Outside, the autumn wind shifts. Leaves scrape across sidewalks. Radios murmur love songs. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, a man named Khrushchev smiles faintly at a chessboard and wonders if anyone will call his bluff. For now, no alarms, no headlines, no panic, only a discovery, made in silence, stored in folders, and hidden behind locked doors. But soon, the sky will open again, and what it reveals next will hold the world in its shadow. Interlude, Ordinary Lives I. Kansas, the drill. The bell rings too softly for what it means. A teacher closes the arithmetic book and smiles the way adults do when they don't want to scare anyone. Under the desks, she says, like it's a game. You fold your knees, press your forehead to varnished wood that smells faintly of polish and pencil shavings. On the wall, a poster shows a cheerful turtle with a helmet, telling you to duck and cover. You're 7. You wonder if the turtle is afraid, too. Outside, the wind rubs the flag against the pole with a dry, metal whisper. When the bell rings again, the desks become desks, the day becomes ordinary, and no one mentions that a desk is not a shield. Havana, the horizon. The fisherman knows the water like a prayer. He reads the tide by the way pelicans sit, the way foam breaks at the rocks. Lately, the sea feels different, not in the waves, but in the quiet. Jets stitch the sky into thin white scars that never quite fade. He checks his nets, glances at the line where blue meets blue, and imagines shapes there, ships he cannot see but knows are waiting. Back on shore, he listens to the radio in the doorway, one shoulder against sun-warmed stucco, the announcer's voice both steady and unsure. His wife brings coffee. They drink slowly, as if time can be stretched by the way you hold a cup. Moscow, the operator. In a room beneath the city, a woman in headphones writes numbers with a steady hand. Her pencil is short. The paper is thin. The voice from the wire speaks English clipped by distance, and she catches fragments the way you catch snowflakes, knowing they melt as soon as they land. She doesn't think about missiles or maps. She thinks about accuracy, about the pride of getting the sequence right. Above her, trams ping through damp streets, and a man sells newspapers that don't say everything they know. When her shift ends, she climbs the stairs into a sky the color of tin, exhales into the cold, and forgets the numbers on purpose. London, the promise. A young couple stands in front of a wedding shop window they cannot afford. The glass shows lace, a suit, a little card with a price, and a smile that assumes everyone will have a day worth dressing for. They don't go inside. They talk instead, about spring, about a small flat with bad light and a kettle that actually whistles. A bus fans damp air across the pavement. From a radio in a cafe door comes a voice from America, measured and careful, full of words like quarantine and resolve. He takes her hand. They decide that love is a kind of defiance, and defiance, right now, is a kind of hope. Florida, the sand line. At dawn the beach looks innocent, a sheet of pewter, slow waves lapping at trenches where boys with crew cuts stand and practice being made of iron. They joke, because joking is lighter than fear. One writes his girl's name in the sand with a boot heel and erases it before anyone can see. When the lieutenant speaks, the sea swallows half his words. Ready positions. Hold, hold. Across the water, there is nothing visible, which is somehow worse. The sun climbs. They sweat. They wait for a thing they cannot picture and do not want to meet. New York, the corner store. A grocer stacks canned peaches into a pyramid that leans the way worry leans on a spine. Customers buy more than they need. They apologize when they notice the last can in a row, and then put it in their basket anyway. A small radio on the shelf behind the counter murmurs the president's voice, firm, polite, a schoolteacher in a dark suit. The grocer leaves the radio on after closing, sits on a wooden crate, and writes figures into a notebook until the numbers blur. Somewhere above the storefront, a baby cries. Somewhere below, the subway shivers past like a giant holding its breath. Stockholm, the autumn light. The Baltic light falls clean through cafe windows, cool as water. A student reads headlines twice, slow, as if careful reading might rearrange the letters into something gentle. Outside, bicycles blink with raindrops. Inside, spoons strike porcelain with the small chime of ordinary life. On the back page, there is a photo of men pointing at a map with straight faces and bent shoulders. He traces the line of a blockade with his fingertip, the way a child traces a river. Then he folds the paper and slips it into his satchel as if tucking away a storm. Cuba, the blackboard. Chalk dust floats in a thin beam of light like a private snowfall. The teacher writes evacuation and underlines it once. In the back row, a boy pretends to have a cough so he can keep the classroom radio turned up. The voice says there may be fighting at sea. The teacher erases the word and writes Paciencia instead. She turns the radio down. The children copy the new word into their notebooks. A page of patience, neat and quiet. Chapter 3. The room where time stopped. The door closes with a sound softer than you expect, a hush, like a curtain falling before the play begins. Inside, the air feels heavier, as if time itself has been thickened and poured into this one narrow room. Ashtrays overflow. Coffee cools in paper cups. Somewhere a typewriter clicks, haltingly, as if afraid to break the silence. The men gathered here have been awake for too long. They speak in low tones, the way people do when they're afraid of waking something larger than themselves. At the head of the table sits John F. Kennedy, 45 years old, his face lined by responsibility more than age. He listens more than he talks, eyes flicking from map to photo, from general to diplomat, searching for an option that doesn't end in smoke. Each new sentence feels like it might tip the world one way or another. Someone suggests a strike. Take them out before they're armed. Someone else reminds the room that such a move could invite a response in Berlin, or worse. A third voice, quieter, speaks of a blockade, a word that sounds cleaner than war, though it hides the same teeth beneath. A fly circles lazily above the table. No one swats it. It's as if the entire room has agreed that movement itself might be dangerous. Down the hall, telephones wait on silent desks. Secretaries pretend to work. Every clock on every wall seems to tick just a little out of sync, as though even time is unsure which side it's on. Kennedy leans back, rubbing his temple, thinking of his brother Robert, younger, restless, sharp, waiting outside with another set of opinions and a fire in his eyes. He thinks of the Americans sleeping peacefully across the country, unaware that their dreams balance on a thread of restraint. He thinks of Khrushchev, distant, impulsive, proud, and wonders if the man sees him as weak or simply human. The discussion circles endlessly, like ships turning in fog. Words like probability, escalation, deterrence fill the air, academic ghosts haunting a room that smells of fear and old tobacco. Someone jokes, softly, that they're all just trying to keep the world alive until morning. No one laughs. By midnight, the decision begins to take shape. Not a strike, not yet. A quarantine, they call it. Not a war, not exactly peace. Something in between, a holding pattern for sanity. Kennedy stands, straightens his suit, and looks out the window. Washington glows dimly beneath a full moon, calm, ordinary, unaware. He thinks of his children sleeping a few miles away, and for the briefest moment, he lets himself imagine the unthinkable. Streets empty, cities gone, the silence after. Then he exhales, and the moment passes. The door opens again. The world moves forward by a single heartbeat. And somewhere, across the ocean, another door closes. In the Kremlin, in a different kind of silence, where another man is wondering whether he's already gone too far. The broadcast. The television flickers. The president sits behind a wooden desk, framed by flags and shadows. His voice is steady, almost too steady. No theatrics, no raised tone, just the weight of words spoken for a world that may not see tomorrow. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. The sentence falls like a gavel. Families lean forward. Somewhere in Kansas, a boy hears only the word missiles. In Boston, a woman grips the edge of her chair and wonders if she should wake her children. The broadcast continues, measured, deliberate. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment is being initiated. He calls it a quarantine, not a blockade. A lawyer's choice of word, designed to slow panic without softening truth. He says America will not back down, that this hemisphere will remain the master of its own house. But beneath the confidence is something else, a tremor barely audible, like breath caught in the throat of civilization. When the cameras click off, the room exhales. Somewhere far away, Khrushchev watches a delayed transmission in silence, his jaw set, his hand trembling slightly as he reaches for a glass of water. Chapter 4: Voices Across the Sea. Far from Washington's clean light, the Kremlin breathes in shadows. Long corridors smell of polish and smoke, the kind that clings to heavy coats and quiet secrets. Outside, Moscow's autumn has turned metallic, a grey sky pressed low over onion domes, snow threatening but never falling. And inside, the clocks tick differently here, slower, heavier, as if measuring not seconds but consequences. Nikita Khrushchev sits behind a desk scarred by years of arguments. His jacket is off, his shirt clings to his neck, and his temper, once famous, now restrained, simmers beneath the surface. In front of him, a telegram glows under the lamp's yellow light, confirmation that the Americans know. They've seen the missiles. The secret is gone. He drums his fingers against the wood, each tap another unanswered question. Was it worth it, placing them there, so close to the enemy's shore? A show of strength, yes. A shield for Cuba, for the revolution, for the fragile idea that the Soviet Union could stand eye to eye with the United States. But now it feels like standing on the roof of the world, holding lightning in bare hands. Advisors shuffle papers, voices rising and falling in cautious waves. One man speaks of honor, another of logic, another of saving face. All of them say Comrade First Secretary before every sentence, as if the title itself could absorb the danger. But even here, pride has its gravity. No one dares say what they all think, that perhaps it has gone too far. A phone rings, distant and shrill. A woman in the hall answers, her heels echoing against marble floors. The sound fades, leaving the room hollow again. Khrushchev stares at a small framed photograph on his desk, his granddaughter smiling beneath a tree. He remembers a summer afternoon, sunlight filtering through leaves, the laughter of a world that did not yet know how close it could come to ending. For a moment he feels very old and very small. He stands abruptly, pacing. "We cannot be seen to retreat," he says finally. The words fall heavy, definitive, but then softer. And yet, we must not destroy what we built. Silence again. Outside the windows, Moscow glows in the fog, a living city unaware that its fate may depend on the next few sentences. Somewhere, in an apartment across the river, a mother rocks her child to sleep to the lullaby of a shortwave radio. She listens for news that never comes, the static her only comfort. Across the sea, Kennedy's blockade ships are already moving into position. On this side, in the Kremlin, the men return to their chairs, their faces pale, their pens scratching at impossible math, the distance between courage and catastrophe. And through it all, the voices continue, soft, deliberate, translated through layers of fear and diplomacy, voices that will shape the next sunrise or erase it entirely. Ordinary lives. Berlin, the echo. In a city that has already learned to live with the weight of history, people stand in queues the way they always do, coats buttoned, collars up, eyes forward. A man reads "Kreis" in a headline and feels something old wake up in his chest. He buys bread. He does not buy cigarettes. On the walk home, he notices the sound of his shoes on the pavement and thinks how loud footsteps are when you are listening for other kinds of thunder. The UN. The room with flags. A translator rehearses a single sentence in 2 languages until it feels like a prayer. Will the representative answer the question? She places the headphone cup to one ear, leaves the other bare for the room's breath. Paper, wool, the coats of men hung on the backs of chairs made for speeches. Flashbulbs pop like small storms. When the ambassador from one country stares at the ambassador from another, and the photographs come out, she will be the wire between the words. She hopes her voice won't shake. It never does. A farm near Pskov. The radio glow. Night comes in early, like a favor. A family sits at a kitchen table while the radio warms the air with a red eye. They eat stew, speak of boots and weather, the cow that will not fatten, the neighbor who keeps borrowing rope. When the newscaster's tone lowers, the mother lifts her chin, listening. No one moves their spoon. When the news ends, the father says, "It will be fine." the way a door says it will hold against the wind. They clear the table. The red eye fades. Boston. The letter unsent. On a third-floor landing, someone writes a letter they never plan to mail. It's to no one in particular, or to everyone. It says, "If this is the last week, you should know that I loved the sound of rain at 3 a.m., and how my father hummed when he shaved, and that once, on the bus, a woman smiled at me for no reason, and I wanted to live an extra day just to see if it would happen again." They fold the page, slip it into a book, and mark the place with a receipt for oranges. The book goes back on the shelf. The shelf is very still. Tokyo. The night shift. In a silent office high above streets threaded with headlights, a clerk stamps documents no one will remember. Sometimes the stamp misfires and the date smears, and she starts again, careful. An American broadcast comes faintly through a wall, clipped, official, translated badly. She recognizes only the familiar cadence of an apology no one wants to make. On her break she looks out at the city and thinks of water boiling, how quickly calm becomes motion. She turns back to her desk and finishes the stack. Finishing things feels like a promise. Somewhere at sea. The listening post. A sailor sits with headphones on, hearing nothing but the sea pretending to be a whisper. He notes the nothing carefully in a logbook that smells of salt and oil. The captain walks by, nods, says nothing, leaves a mug. On page after page the sailor writes, "Silence at 0200. Silence at 0300. Silence at 0400. When he finally sleeps, the sea keeps whispering into the headphones, though they lie on the table beside him. He dreams of a shore with no name, and a sky that doesn't choose sides. Anywhere. The prayer without words. A hand turns off a lamp. Another hand finds another in the dark. No one speaks. The house ticks and settles like an old animal finding a place to rest. You listen to your own breathing as if it belongs to someone you're trying to comfort. Somewhere, a siren tests its voice and then thinks better of it. Morning will come, you tell yourself. Let it. UN Confrontation. Adlai Stevenson. At the United Nations, fluorescent light hums over a table lined with microphones and nerves. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson faces his Soviet counterpart, calm but cold. Behind him, aides unveil the photographs, silver missiles laid across the Cuban landscape like bones under sunlight. Gasps ripple through the chamber. Stevenson's voice remains quiet. I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over. Cameras flash, capturing the frozen faces of men who suddenly remember the cost of rhetoric. For a heartbeat, no one speaks. It feels less like diplomacy than confession. The letter that pleads. Night in Moscow. Rain against the Kremlin windows. Khrushchev dictates, pacing, his words tumbling faster than the typist can capture them. He speaks of fathers and sons, of graves and harvests, of the absurdity of annihilation. It is a confession written in the language of power, but meant to sound like prayer. If there is no intention to tighten the knot of war, let us not pull on the ends of the rope. The typist hesitates. It's too poetic, too strange, but he insists. Leave it, he says. They'll understand. The letter is sealed and sent. No one in the room sleeps. In Washington, when Kennedy reads it, the words feel human, clumsy, sincere, almost desperate. He taps the paper once with his finger and whispers. He's scared. For a moment, fear feels like common ground. Chapter 5. 13 Days of Fear. The news does not arrive all at once. It seeps slowly, through headlines, whispers, and the uneasy tremor in a newscaster's voice. Missiles in Cuba, the radio says, as if naming the storm could keep it away. You're in your kitchen again. The same table, the same clock ticking above the stove. Only now, the air feels different, thinner, sharper, like the world has shifted a few inches closer to the edge. Outside, the wind moves the curtains and you flinch, not sure why. Across America, people begin to listen differently. Radios stay on longer. Children's laughter sounds misplaced, too bright for the moment. Mothers fold laundry while the president speaks about quarantine, defense, and utmost readiness. Fathers nod without speaking. In basements, boxes of canned beans and bottled water begin to multiply. At night, families gather around television screens that flicker like tiny campfires against the dark. Anchors speak in calm tones, but their eyes betray the truth. They are scared too. Every sentence ends with a pause that feels like an unspoken prayer. The next commercial break feels obscene. Schools hand out thin pamphlets with drawings of cartoon families crouched under desks. Children trace the outlines with pencils, not understanding the point. In small towns, sirens are tested without warning, just to make sure they still work. In cities, crowds gather outside storefronts to read newspapers pinned behind glass. U.S. blockades Cuba, one headline says. War possible, says another. And yet, life goes on, awkwardly, stubbornly. Buses still run. Cigarettes are still lit. A baseball game plays on the radio, half drowned by static. You hear the score, but not the comfort it once gave. In Havana, people sleep in clothes, ready to run. In Florida, soldiers dig trenches in the sand and stare toward the horizon, where nothing moves but the wind. In London, Paris, Stockholm, the same quiet dread spreads across borders. The world feels suddenly small, as if everyone is standing in the same narrow hallway, waiting for a door to open or a siren to sound. The nights stretch long. Letters are written, just in case. A man kisses his wife good-night with more care than usual, memorizing the shape of her breathing. Teenagers sit on car hoods beneath a wide October sky, counting stars and wondering which one might fall first. No bombs fall. No orders are given. But the silence itself becomes unbearable. By the seventh day, people begin to dream differently. Dreams of light too bright to see, of running without moving, of time stopping mid-breath. They wake with the same thought. If it happens, will we even know? Somewhere, in an underground bunker, a switch waits. Above ground, the world turns quietly, still pretending to be normal, still daring to hope. And every human heartbeat, from Havana to Moscow to New York, keeps time with a single shared fear. That morning might not come. Chapter 6. The Letter and the Line. By the 9th day, exhaustion begins to feel like a language. No one speaks it fluently, but everyone understands. Eyes red from sleeplessness, nerves drawn thin. The men in Washington and Moscow no longer look like rivals, only mirrors. Each side waiting, listening, afraid to breathe too loudly. Then, a letter arrives. Typed on plain paper, carried through diplomatic channels that now feel like veins in a dying body. From Khrushchev, not the blustering, chest-beating Khrushchev of speeches and rallies, but the human one. The words are strange, emotional, almost pleading. He writes of children, of the sun that shines equally on all people, of the madness of mutual destruction. Let us not pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, he says. If we do, the knot will be pulled tighter. Kennedy reads it once, twice, then again. He hears, beneath the rhetoric, something close to fear, and something closer still to reason. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the horizon seems less certain, less doomed. But hope, like peace, is fragile. The next morning, a second letter arrives, colder, angrier, written not by a man but by a committee. The tone has changed. The offer withdrawn. The line has blurred again between caution and chaos. Outside the White House, reporters wait in the cold, their breath rising in white clouds. In living rooms across the world, people sit beside their radios, listening for the sound that might end everything. Every transmission crackles with electricity and dread. One false move, one wrong order, and the world would become a whisper in its own history. On the 13th day, the sun rises pale and distant. In the Atlantic, American destroyers close in on a Soviet submarine. Inside the sub, the air is hot, heavy with carbon dioxide and panic. The crew hasn't heard from Moscow in days. Their instruments flicker. They believe war may already have begun. The captain orders the nuclear torpedo armed. A single man, Vasily Arkhipov, refuses. He talks, argues, pleads. His voice, quiet but firm, becomes the one thread holding the world together. The torpedo is disarmed. The sub surfaces. And history exhales, unaware of how close it came to silence. In Washington, another letter is drafted, one that answers the first, not the second. Kennedy chooses empathy over ego, restraint over victory. His message is brief. Remove the missiles, and the United States will remove theirs from Turkey. Simple. Human. A bargain wrapped in grace. The message is sent. Hours pass. Then a day. Then another. And finally, a reply. Short. Accepting. Almost tender in its simplicity. We agree to remove the weapons from Cuba, it says. The crisis is over. But the words come too late for celebration. Everyone is too tired to cheer. They only sit, staring at the paper, realizing how near they came to ending everything that ever was. The phones stop ringing. The sirens stay silent. In the stillness that follows, the world feels different, lighter but changed, as though the air itself remembers. The seas whisper. At the United Nations, fluorescent light hums over a table lined with microphones and nerves. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson faces his Soviet counterpart, calm but cold. Behind him, aides unveil the photographs, silver missiles laid across the Cuban landscape like bones under sunlight. Gasps ripple through the chamber. Stevenson's voice remains quiet. I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over. Cameras flash, capturing the frozen faces of men who suddenly remember the cost of rhetoric. Back in Moscow, the second Khrushchev letter is already being typed, curt, angry, stripped of humanity. The tone is official, almost bureaucratic. The words replace brotherhood with duty, understanding with consequence. It's as if a hand has torn the first letter in two. You are pushing humanity toward the abyss of nuclear war. Kennedy reads it with a hollow look. He closes his eyes, then opens them again, slower this time. I'm going to answer the first one, he says, and history pivots on that quiet choice. Near-miss sequence. The radar ghost. It's near midnight in North Dakota when the radar screen blooms white. An operator rubs his eyes, thinking it's fatigue, static, a trick of fluorescent light. But the trace doesn't vanish. It moves, fast, deliberate, straight across the Arctic line. For 3 seconds the room becomes a cage of silence. Phones lift. Pens freeze mid-air. Then the lieutenant leans forward, heartbeat audible, and whispers, "Confirm." Another screen flickers. The contact splits in 2, then 4, then none. A ghost. False echo. Moonlight on high clouds. The operator exhales, feeling the air scrape his throat. He marks the log carefully. False alarm, no launch. His hand trembles as he writes it, as if aware that a few more seconds of doubt might have ended everything he loves without anyone ever knowing his name. The U-2 over Cuba. October 27th. A clear sky, sharp as glass. Major Rudolph Anderson's U-2 glides high above Cuba, cameras blinking open like patient eyes. Below, a missile crew stares upward through binoculars, waiting for orders that haven't come. A phone rings in the bunker. The voice on the other end is calm, almost bored. "You are authorized." The missile rises, invisible at first, then a sudden thread of white cutting the sky. Anderson never sees it. A flash, a shudder, then nothing. Fragments fall through blue air, through silence, through history. In Washington, word spreads through the corridors like wind under a door. One death, one spark, the first and almost the last. Kennedy closes his eyes. He says, "We must not answer. Not yet." The room feels smaller, as if the walls themselves are listening for restraint. The U-2 over Siberia. The same day, half a world away, another U-2 loses its bearings near the North Pole. The compass spins. Auroras veil the stars. The pilot taps the gauge, muttering to himself, unaware he has crossed into Soviet airspace. Below, fighters scramble from Chukotka, engines coughing frost. They climb into the green glow, guided by radar that shouts intruder. For 9 minutes, the sky holds its breath. The American pilot finally sees the horizon tilt back to west and turns hard, heart pounding. The Soviet jets never find him. They find only the echo of his wake. Later, both governments will classify the incident. No one will mention how close the Arctic came to lighting up like dawn. The misread message. That night, a teletype in Washington spits out a cable translated badly from Russian. A single missing comma changes the meaning of a sentence, turns "we will remove missiles" into "we will not remove missiles." For 20 minutes, the confusion holds. Telephones ring. Advisors argue. A colonel in the Pentagon begins drafting contingency orders. Then a young translator, a woman no one remembers, leans over the page, frowns, and says quietly, "There's a mistake." She corrects it with a pencil, erases the comma, and saves more lives than she will ever meet. The airfield that waited. At Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, pilots sleep in their cockpits. Engines are warm, fuel tanks full, coordinates folded into pockets. A red phone sits on a steel table, waiting to ring. It never does. Morning comes gray and humid. Someone brings coffee. Someone laughs at nothing. The planes stay where they are, silver and innocent beneath a sky that almost asked them to burn. The silence after. In both capitals, dawn arrives as apology. No one celebrates. No one trusts the quiet. Kennedy and Khrushchev sit miles apart, in rooms that smell of smoke and metal, wondering if the other is still breathing. For 13 days, chance had played the part of mercy, a cloud, a compass, a comma, a man who said wait. And when the world finally steadies, it feels smaller, older, and unspeakably fragile. Chapter 7. The World Exhales. It ends the way most miracles do, quietly. No fireworks, no grand speeches, no applause. Just the slow return of sound to a world that had forgotten how to breathe. In Havana, soldiers lower their rifles. The sea, restless for weeks, lies calm again, pretending it never knew the word blockade. In Moscow, a man folds a telegram and sets it aside, his hands trembling not with fear now, but with something close to relief. And in Washington, the lights burn late, as they always do, but this time the conversations are softer. Someone laughs, just once, and the sound feels almost foreign. Across the world, people wake to a new kind of morning. The sun feels sharper, the air cleaner, as if everything has been washed in gratitude. Neighbors smile at each other on their way to work. Children play outside again. A few still glance at the sky, half expecting to see something there. A sign, a shadow, a reminder, but it's just blue, endless and ordinary. Kennedy walks through the White House garden, jacket off, eyes tired. He thinks of letters written, words unsaid, the thin line between courage and catastrophe. Somewhere, his daughter chases a butterfly through the grass, laughing. He watches her for a moment and feels the weight of what didn't happen. It's heavier than victory. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev sits alone, listening to the faint hum of the city outside his window. He knows this peace will cost him, politically, personally, but he also knows it was the only choice left to men who still believed in tomorrow. He exhales, slow and long, and wonders if the Americans understand that he, too, has a family. Around the world, those 13 days fade into memory, but they leave something behind, a scar, invisible yet permanent, a reminder of how close the world came to ending, and how fragile reason can be when pride holds the match. Years later, people will say it was diplomacy, or deterrence, or luck that saved them. Maybe all of that is true, but perhaps it was something simpler, the stubborn will of a few people in 2 great cities who refused to stop seeing the human on the other side of the ocean. For now, the radios go silent, the bunkers empty, the maps are folded away. The world exhales, a long, trembling sigh that drifts into history, and though the threat lingers, and the shadow of war will stretch on for decades, there is peace tonight. Not the kind written into treaties, but the kind that hums quietly inside the heart, where fear used to live. The sound of paper. When it is over, the letters are filed into folders stamped secret, then declassified, then for public release. Years later, they sit in glass cases, the paper yellowing around the edges. Visitors lean in, reading the words that once held the world in balance. The ink has faded, but the space between the sentences still hums, a low, steady reminder of how close we came to silence. Aftermath and amp, reflection, the line between then and now. The world did not end. That, in itself, felt miraculous. But miracles are never loud. They sound like paper being folded, like boots on wet pavement, like the sigh of a city realizing it still exists. In Washington, the corridors emptied slowly. Aides carried stacks of documents to file rooms that smelled of dust and reprieve. Someone left a coffee cup beside the Situation Room telephone and never came back for it. Kennedy walked the garden path behind the White House, head bare to the autumn wind. He thought of the sea, that same sea where ships had faced each other in silence, and how thin the water had been between everything and nothing. In Moscow, the morning was pale and cold. Khrushchev listened to his grandson playing with a wooden airplane and smiled at the sound. He didn't tell the child that only days earlier, real planes had waited to carry fire. Instead, he poured tea, watched steam rise, and felt something loosen inside him. Pride, perhaps, or fear, or both. In Havana, soldiers packed away equipment under the bright Caribbean sun. Children ran through the dust, pretending the trucks were dinosaurs. A woman hung laundry that smelled of soap and ocean salt. She looked at the horizon, still guarded, still alive, and whispered a prayer not of thanks, but of exhaustion. Across oceans, the world tried to return to its rhythm. Factories reopened. Radios played songs again. But something had shifted in the collective breath, a faint hesitation between inhaling and exhaling. It would stay there for decades. Soon came new words for the new peace. Hotline, deterrence, mutual assured destruction. Metal cables were strung beneath the Atlantic, linking Washington to Moscow, a direct voice line so the next time fear visited, it could at least call ahead. The line clicked to life in August 1963, carrying its first cautious syllables. The world pretended to feel safer. But those who had lived through the 13 days knew the truth. Safety is only the brief pause between disasters. Decades passed. The men aged. The letters yellowed in their folders. Children who once hid beneath desks grew old and told their grandchildren that they had lived through the week the world stopped spinning. The grandchildren listened politely, not quite believing. And yet, in every generation since, there are moments when the air goes still again, when headlines sound too familiar, when the horizon feels too quiet. Then someone remembers October 1962 and whispers, "We have been here before." The lesson of those days was never written into law, but it lingers, in the hesitation before pressing send, in the silence between nations, in the knowledge that sometimes survival depends on a single voice saying wait. The ocean that once divided enemies now carries fiber-optic threads of light, thin as forgiveness. Messages travel where missiles once aimed. And if you listen closely, through the static of history, you can still hear the echo, a low heartbeat of restraint, still pulsing beneath the noise. The world keeps turning. The sea keeps its secrets. The line between then and now remains, invisible but alive, a reminder drawn across the map of time. Now close your eyes. Let the tension fade like tide withdrawing from shore. You are still here. The planet still hums beneath your feet. The story is not over. It never truly ends. It only quiets. You're listening to echoes of war.